The Joseph Smith Papers Documents Volume 8 is now available. What's in it and why does it matter? Consider that it is in this volume and the time period that it covers that the Nauvoo Temple begins construction. Also, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles return from their mission to Great Britain and begin to take their place next to the first presidency in church government. In addition, Elder Orson Hyde of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles dedicates the Holy Land for the gathering of the Jews. And November 28, 1841, the prophet Joseph Smith declares the Book of Mormon the most correct of any book on earth and the keystone of our religion. And there is much more.
Documents Volume 8 of the Joseph Smith Papers covers the months from February 1841 through November 1841. A relatively short 10-month, which has largely been glossed over or overlooked in Latter-day Saint history. It's largely because the period before has the founding of Nauvoo and the revelation in January 1841 that sets the course for building the temple and the Nauvoo house in the city and calling for other components of city life. Fast forward beyond these 10 months and you start to have the issues come up with John C. Bennett, which are pretty compelling and interesting for the telling of Latter-day Saint history. And so these 10 months often get looked over, but the beauty of the Joseph Smith Papers is that we have the opportunity to dive into and really dig deep into all of the documents. And so we find in this period in 1841 some actually very important and interesting events that happen.
Among those interesting and important events is the municipal government of Nauvoo taking shape.
The murders in Missouri, the extent of the deprivations and the inhumanity that took place at the hands of the Missouri State Militia and other mobocratic forces, it casts a very long shadow on Mormon history. A way of thinking about this is they collectively share this deep trauma that's occurred to them. Now, not everyone suffered as much as others, but all of them, used to live in Missouri and don't anymore, right? If they stay in the church. And this idea that governments are not just going to be passive and not try to stop persecution, but they are going to become the proponents of and the perpetrators of persecution itself, casts a long shadow in Nauvoo. They want built into their charter their own court system, so they don't have to deal with corrupt, evil courts as they see them, right? Courts that are doing the bidding of politicians rather than the bidding of justice. They have their own militia that's built in. They want to be able to protect and defend themselves. They're hopeful still. In 1841, Joseph is still hopeful that at some point, some politician will defend them, will listen to them, will take up their cause. But they are still reacting as if they might not.
Joseph Smith is elected in February 1841 to serve as a city councilor, is a committee member on almost every committee that's created. He introduces a plenitude of ordinances for the formation of city government to make sure that the city of Nauvoo is a place that's going to be welcoming to all and equal for all. And one of the biggest ordinances that he introduces and that is passed by the Nauvoo City Council is a religious tolerance ordinance. The actual title is An Ordinance in Relation to Religious Societies. And its tenets are, and it lists out a number of different sects and denominations and calls for the equal toleration and religious freedom for each of those in the city. So he wants to see Nauvoo be a place that's welcoming to all peoples. Another thing the city council does is it authorizes and then the Nauvoo Legion, and it organizes the Nauvoo Legion. And so the Legion starts in earnest in these months, starts with its first meeting in February of 1841 as well. So Nauvoo city government, Nauvoo Legion, all getting started in this time period.
This newest volume of the Joseph Smith Papers not only describes the beginnings of the city of Nauvoo, but it also describes the beginnings of one of the saints' most bitter and dangerous enemies.
So Thomas Sharpe is the editor of the Warsaw Signal, a newspaper that's pretty influential in Hancock County. It's a partisan paper. Sharpe is a Whig, an ardent Whig, and he writes about politics, political matters, and things like that. And he starts to see that with the Nauvoo city government passing the many ordinances that it had been passing, and then the Nauvoo Legion, which he saw at that cornerstone ceremony, they were part of the procession. He started to fear that too much power was being concentrated in one person, in Joseph Smith. So this, I think, begins to turn Sharpe into an anti-Mormon, really. He says that the way that the Latter-day Saints are running things in Nauvoo is contrary to American republicanism. And he starts to write these negative reports about Joseph Smith, about Latter-day Saints. And that is the foundation of what becomes an even greater antagonistic relationship between these two. Thomas Sharpe ultimately founds an anti-Mormon political party for Hancock County that tries to do quite a bit to halt Mormon power in the area.
Sharpe was also angry because Nauvoo was outstripping Warsaw in growth. Immigrants were coming into Nauvoo by the hundreds.
The January 1841 revelation, now Doctrine and Covenants 124, had commanded the saints to build a temple and had commanded them to gather and to bring their treasures and their funds to help build that temple. But within this volume, you begin to see the real efforts to gather the saints into Nauvoo. In May 1841, Joseph puts out a notice calling on the saints to gather specifically to Nauvoo so that they can help with the temple. They'd been scattered throughout Iowa and other Illinois communities and things, and Joseph encourages them to gather close into Nauvoo to help with the temple in particular. And you start to see some of the emigrating companies from England showing up in larger numbers in Nauvoo. All of these people need places to live, and the land in Nauvoo, even though they have immense tracts of land, starts to fill up rather quickly. One of the things I really like in this volume is you see Joseph dealing with these land issues. At the very beginning of the volume, Joseph is made the trustee in trust for the church. That position meant that he was financially responsible for the land in the name of the church. Of course, he had purchased large amounts of land in his own name when they first moved to Nauvoo, but now he's legally and financially responsible for all of these transactions in the church's name. Joseph is doing the best that he can, but some are seeing him in less than honest terms, including some saints that are emigrating to Nauvoo. And so Joseph is trying to deal with all of this at the same time as he's trying to pay for these lands.
And speaking of documents, there's an event that occurs in Nauvoo that centers on one of the most important and sacred documents in Latter-day Saint history.
On October 2nd, 1841, as the saints are meeting for a general conference in Nauvoo, they take time out, and Joseph Smith dedicates a cornerstone for the Nauvoo house, one of the central building projects for the church. And during this cornerstone dedication ceremony, Joseph primarily, but a few other saints, are putting some items in this cavity of the cornerstone. Some coins, some issues of the times and seasons, and a few other artifacts like that. And while this is going on, Joseph pauses, and he sort of then abruptly runs home and says, I have something that I want to deposit into the cornerstone. He runs home and he gets the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon that he'd been holding on to since he'd translated it back in 1829, and brings it out. And there's one account that says that Joseph said something to the effect of, holding on to this has given me enough trouble, and I want to put it here for posterity. And so he takes that manuscript, places it in the Nauvoo house cornerstone. It gets sealed up and then encased, and then they continue building over it.
In the years that followed, the Mississippi River rose and flooded. Then, in the 1870s, Emma's second husband, Louis Bideman, decided to remodel the unfinished Nauvoo house, and in so doing, he opened up that cornerstone and discovered that water had seeped in and ruined most of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. Only about 23% survived intact.
"175 deaths happened in 1841, including Don Carlos Smith, Joseph's brother, dies, and then Don Carlos, Joseph's son, his infant son, both die in August, about a week apart from each other. And so Joseph's dealing with a personal tragedy while he's trying to manage all of these many aspects of his life with the city government, the church, the Nauvoo Legion, managing lands and land distribution. So many things that Joseph is doing on top of just dealing with family life, trying to raise his family with his wife Emma, and then dealing with the death of his brother and his infant son. And you can see in some ways how that takes a toll on a person, and that's something that the documents bear out.
So one of the really interesting things you get in Documents Volume 8 is you see the Quorum of the 12 begin to transition from a body that has increasing power outside of the central governing area of the church, outside of Nauvoo, to gaining power as Joseph Smith gives them more and more and more responsibility inside of Nauvoo. They start taking on temporal affairs. They start taking on more ecclesiastical roles, like presiding over this mission. So you can actually see that transition happening. You can see people's reaction to it as, wait a minute, I didn't think this is what the apostles were supposed to do. And Joseph saying, no, this is the reason why. And so you almost get this feeling with the Quorum of the 12 that you have this gradual implementation of power, that Joseph gives them more and more and more authority that will eventually culminate in Joseph rolling off the keys of the kingdom to them in the spring of 1844, giving them all of the keys, power, and authority to lead the church. That process appears to begin here in 1841. Another interesting aspect that you have in this volume is, while several volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers have recorded sermons of Joseph Smith, in this volume you start to get them with greater rapidity. A reader of this book is going to read sermons and teachings of Joseph Smith that they've probably never heard of before. They'll be capturing some of Joseph Smith's teaching, some of his thoughts, some of the things that he's saying in very much a almost real-time, almost haphazard sort of way, as some of the way that these are recorded. Obviously, some are recorded a little later, some are edited, some are published. There are some that are easier to read. But the volume contains a substantial number of sermons and discourses that Joseph Smith is going to give. And so it is a valuable thing, I think, for both members of the church and non-members of the church to read, to get an understanding of, in 1841, what are the pieces of theology that matter to Joseph Smith? What is he spending his time on? It won't come as a surprise to many members of the church familiar with history that he's spending a considerable amount of time on the idea of baptisms for the dead, right? That this newly introduced doctrine is something that's very precious to Joseph, something that he cares a lot about. You sometimes get the feeling that Joseph has received just an incredible wealth of revelatory knowledge from God and isn't quite sure how to distribute it all, right? Well, it's too deep for a distribution to a wider church conference. It's too particular to just not tell anybody. I mean, how do you deal with that?
The mission of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in 1840 and 41 was to more than just the British Isles. Documents Volume 8 contains correspondence between the prophet Joseph Smith and another of the apostles called to another prophesied field of labor.
Orson Hyde's mission to Palestine grew out of a vision he had in March of 1840, where he saw major world cities roll before his eyes, specifically London, Constantinople, Amsterdam, and Jerusalem.
And it's within this volume's time period that he visits Jewish congregations throughout Europe and tries to find any connection that he can with the Jewish peoples. In this process, he begins to open up the way to preach the gospel in Germany, in the Netherlands, in other areas throughout Europe.
Now, while he's there, he's also composing a longer booklet about the history of the church and includes an account of Joseph Smith's first vision, and again, the priesthood and doctrine of the church. He's writing this up in English, but he already has the idea that this will be translated into German. And he excerpts part of this and sends copies, in English of course, back to Joseph Smith.
As Orson Hyde is traveling throughout Europe, he has an interesting experience. He sees an American flag and feels these overwhelming feelings of patriotism well up in him. And he writes in this letter to Joseph that he felt to declare, "I am an American." It's an interesting thing that happens is he developed a love for Europe, a love for the German language, which he was learning, but he also felt new feelings of patriotism for his own country as he took this mission.
And this is certainly a very poignant moment for Orson Hyde. He's seen it all in vision, but now he's there. And as he walks most of the major landmarks and speaks with many of the people there, it all kind of comes flooding back to his memory. And even when he goes to the top of the Mount of Olives and stands there and kind of looks around at the vast landscape in front of him, Orson Hyde describes it as like a vision and almost somebody pinch me kind of an experience. Orson Hyde says, I wasn't sure if I was really there or if it was a vision of my mind. And on the morning of October 24th, 1841, he wakes up before dawn, very early, and climbs to the top of the Mount of Olives. And he says, with pen and paper, he then sits down and through revelation writes out and gives the dedicatory prayer on the top of the Mount of Olives, specifically for the restoration of the Jews. But his prayer is very, very literate and beautiful and expansive, and it does much more than that. He speaks of rebuilding the city. He also speaks of the welfare of the church, to bless its leaders and the future of the church, Also, that hearts will simply be softened. Amidst the political turmoil that's been happening the last couple years before his arrival, Orson Hyde is cognizant of this and is blessing that then leaders of nations and leaders of church and figures can come together and find peace, that then this restoration can take place, that Jesus Christ might return one day. So he offers this prayer, and then he erects a pile of stones. He says, according to the ancient custom and in the memorial of what he's just done. And because it was so dreamlike, he also collects a branch from an olive tree as a kind of memento for himself to remember that indeed he was there.
Elder Orson Hyde returned to Nauvoo in April of 1842. The full effect and significance of his mission is yet to be revealed. Documents Volume 8 is now available. It's a valuable resource. Why is it valuable? Because most published histories are the work of historians and scholars poring over original documents and then summarizing and drawing their conclusions. The Joseph Smith Papers volumes and Documents Volume 8 give us the opportunity to search those same documents and draw our own conclusions. And there is so much to discover. I'm Glenn Rawson, and thank you for joining us.